I've always had a hard time attempting to wrap my head around the motives of Queen Marika. The question of her motives can be posed in a broad sense, such as what was the point of it all? Or smaller aspects of her individual goals. Why did she banish the Nox underground? What exactly did she do to betray the Horn Scent? What exactly drove her to the brink, causing the shattering of the Elden Ring? And the answers to some of these questions are pretty well fleshed out in-game. I personally have an entire video dedicated to Marika's motives in regards to her dealings with the Horn Scent. But the point is, you could watch hundreds of YouTube videos covering these individual topics along with others, and while the question may remain the same, the answers will all differ in some way, shape, or form. The lore of Elden Ring in particular is far more divisive than that of other From Software titles such as Dark Souls. Where players may disagree about small details, the lore and themes of the larger story of Dark Souls is pretty well agreed upon. Elden Ring, on the other hand, is not this way. You can pose a very simple solution to a seemingly well-expounded point of lore, and half the community will still disagree. And don't mistake me, I don't see this as a problem. It's actually my favorite part of the game. Questions like these, not to mention the quality of the game itself, will keep Elden Ring alive and relevant in the hearts of fans for many years. In an interview with GameSpot, creator of Elden Ring, Hidetaka Miyazaki, was asked if he watches fan theory videos. His response, quote, "I watch them. Of course, I can't watch them all, but I do watch them, and I actually enjoy the process. I think it's quite fun to see how people piece together their own theories or working theories based on a lot of fragmented information that the game provides. Some can be derived from hints in the game, others are completely theorized. But regardless, for me, I find it quite enjoyable to see the different interpretations that the fans and audiences have," end quote. I read a lot of Miyazaki interviews, I just think he's a really interesting guy. But supposedly all of the answers to our deepest lore questions do lie in his head. In another interview he says, quote, "I have no intention of forcing any of the storyline upon any of the players out there, and there will be no official statements made about the true story of the game. First of all, yes, there is a perfect storyline in my head. However, I have no intention at all of enforcing that storyline to the players out there. Only those storyline elements that actually make it into the game are something I need to force players to accept as a base for building up their own interpretation of the world. And there will be no official statements made about the true story of the game," end quote. These statements were made in regards to Dark Souls 3 back in 2016. However, I still think it gives us a really good insight into the mind of this developer. That even though he has an idea of what the true lore is, it doesn't invalidate our own. It implies that the theory crafting is one of his favorite aspects of these games as well, like myself and likely you watching this video. So while this lengthy Miyazaki game philosophy tangent may have seemed out of place, I believe that it was a good way to preface this video, seeing as the question posed in this video is one that has been asked and tackled many times before. However, I believe that with the recent addition of the DLC and the extensive information we've been given in regards to Marika's past, it's time to take another, closer look into this question and attempt to discover what Marika's plan, or plan in the end, was. Why the Tarnished, why the shattering of the Elden Ring, why the guidance of grace, and more. Count Ymir comes in pretty hard as the lore guru of the DLC. With his dialogue along with his questline and the remembrance of the Mother of Fingers, our understanding of the base game is much changed, and we learn that Marika was of even greater consequence to the going-ons of the base game. Marika brought the Tarnished back, not the Greater Will. Marika is the guidance of grace, obvious enough, but nonetheless nigh fact now. And a revelation that I believe to be very significant, Marika was not imprisoned inside the Erd Tree by the Greater Will, nor the Fingers. She was imprisoned by Radagon. The Staff of the Great Beyond states, "The Mother received signs from the Greater Will, from the beyond of the microcosm. Despite being broken and abandoned, she kept waiting for another message to come. The Gazing Finger, also received from the remembrance of the Mother of Fingers, reads, From within the center of the fingerprint that wrinkles the creature's foremost protrusion, a tiny wart-like eye gazes vacantly into the beyond. For those that know, I apologize, but I feel this worth mentioning. Vacantly in this context means to do something in a way that lacks feeling or expression, or to show no interest or mental activity. Matir was just waiting. So these item descriptions, along with the dialogue from Count Ymir, which states that Marika and the fingers that guided her were unhinged from the start, heavily imply that Marika, from the start, was not being guided by the greater will. Now, what this means in terms of her being the vessel for the Elden Ring, I can't say for sure. However, I've always viewed that aspect of the game as more of a mechanical necessity, that the Elden Ring needs a vessel, whether the greater will is hanging about or not, and Marika took on that role. This falls in line nicely with the additional dialogue we get from Saint Trina in the DLC, that godhood is indeed a prison. However, more relevant to the current topic, again, Marika was not being guided by the greater will. She may have been receiving guidance from the fingers, but the fingers were detached from the greater will. I believe it quite likely that she was still receiving guidance from the fingers alone for quite some time. The Two Fingers heirloom reads, "Fingers cannot speak, yet these are eloquent. Persistently they wriggle, spelling out mysteries in the air. Thus did we gain the words of our faith." And the coded sword reads, "Champions would gather at the round table hold in days long past, when the Two Fingers were masters of oration, their flesh yet full of vigor." So in days long past, when the fingers were still full of vigor, they would communicate regularly with the champions of the hold. These sorts of statements make me believe that the fingers, while detached from the greater will, were still offering whatever form of guidance they could. Now, it has to be at least considered that given what we know, all of this at this point could have been the designs of Queen Marika. She could have been the, quote, guidance of the fingers. We really just don't know, and it's not particularly relevant to this video. However, as a takeaway, it should at least be known that whether Marika was completely on her own or was receiving unhinged guidance from the detached fingers, she was in either case largely on her own, so far as Count Ymir is to be believed. I've seen this sentiment randomly throughout the community that perhaps Count Ymir shouldn't be believed. Now, I think he can be believed, first of all because the item descriptions fall in line with his dialogue, but also, in a game where the lore revelations are already sparse enough, I think an unreliable narrator would have to have motives largely set against our goal, such as those that support the Golden Order in the base game, Hunter D or Radigan. It doesn't take a long time in-game to determine that the Golden Order likely isn't all it's cracked up to be. There's plenty of hints, and the developer clearly wants us to draw this conclusion. Not least of all the fingers looking like disheveled, rotten carcasses. However, Count Ymir's goals are largely detached from ours. He has no reason to lie or to have been misled. His questline is optional after all. So I think finding him and doing his questline is meant to give us a deeper look into the lore, for the player who wants that sort of thing. I feel like this was the intention of the developer, just given the context of his appearance in-game, and therefore can presume that his dialogue can, for the most part, be trusted. Nonetheless, he's clearly quite unhinged in his own right. But either way, this information is among the greatest revelations of the DLC. And while most of you, I'm sure, are already well informed on the updated lore of the fingers, the implications of this lore is even more profound. The guidance of grace, the return of the tarnished, the Erdtree faith. It's not Marika, the fingers, the finger readers, etc. It's just her. Marika is the catalyst for all of it, and while her faith, seemingly in herself, began to wane, Radigan took over most of the operation of what was going on, and the Golden Order was born, eventually leading to him imprisoning her within the Erdtree. Because that's just it. It had to have been him. With the information we've learned in the DLC about the fingers and everything else that was going on with the Erdtree faith, Radigan is the only one who could have done this. Marika's motives pertaining to her betrayal of the Hornsent are a little easier to understand than her motives in the base game. The DLC does a good job of laying out her past, where she came from, the origins of her godhood, and so on. How she got from A to B and B to C is obviously still being debated and discussed, but her motives specifically make enough sense. Wrath, revenge, grief, and it's so much deeper than that, and I have a long video already breaking that down and giving my thoughts, so watch that if you're interested. So I'm not going to get into the jarring of the shaman and perhaps even Marika herself, and Marika's relationship with the Hornsent as a whole, because it falls outside the scope of this video and I've covered it previously, but in brief, her quote, betrayal of the Hornsent was brought upon by the Hornsent themselves. What they did to her and her people, the shaman people, and upon Marika's ascension to godhood, the removal of the rune of death, so that she would never have to bear witness to another of her loved ones suffering and dying again. A long time passed between the time of Marika's ascension to godhood and the shattering. Plenty of time for her motives to change. I like to think 1,000 years at least between her ascension to godhood and the shattering of the Elden Ring. And I know many of you will think that that's just absolute heresy that it's not longer. Well, you can definitely make a timeline and pretty confidently put events of the lore into chronological order. There's not much in regards to the actual passage of time, aside from the obvious that it's been a very long time. I've always thought Marika's godhood lasted 1,000 years, just in headcanon because of Ranni's dialogue, quote, 1,000-year voyage under the wisdom of the moon. And now with Miquella's dialogue from the DLC, 1,000-year voyage guided by compassion. So there you go, that's my headcanon. Please feel free to tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. I've always wanted to know just how long it's been. Anyways, she seized power with the help of her consort. The Erdtree and the Erdtree faith became dominant throughout the lands between. But by the time we meet Marika, things have clearly changed significantly. Really by the time the Tarnished begin to return to the lands between. She's no longer trying to seize power by force. In fact, it seems she's trying to give her power up, and I believe that much of what Marika tried to accomplish later on in her godhood revolved around her attempting to give her power up in a manner that best suited the coming age. So Ranni's dialogue, which I'm sure all of you have heard before, quote, I was once an Empyrean of the demigods, only I, Miquella, and Melania could claim that title. Each of us was chosen by our own 2 fingers as a candidate to succeed Queen Marika to become the new god of the coming age. So the 2 fingers were planning for Marika's departure. And given what we now know about the 2 fingers, I think it's safe to say that in truth it was Marika who was planning for her own departure. During Goldmask's quest, Brother Corhin at one point states, quote, the Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god. End quote. Therefore, if Marika was eternal and the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring, why were candidates to succeed Queen Marika being looked into at all? Set aside the fact that the Golden Order had largely failed and the lands between were in ruins. The idea of choosing possible candidates to be the next god goes directly against the idea that Marika is the one true god. While again, setting aside the obvious reason of the failures of the Golden Order, and the fact that the existence of Empyreans likely wasn't a secret, given that characters such as Sage Dowry and War Counselor E.G. are aware of their existence. In all likelihood, Empyreans were chosen by Queen Marika as a plan to cast aside her godhood and bring an end to the Golden Order. I add bring an end to the Golden Order because I believe that is a mostly undisputed motive of hers, evidenced by her dialogue at the churches and the fact that she was imprisoned within the Erdtree by Radagon for her deeds against the Golden Order. Marika's hammer reads, the tool with which Queen Marika shattered the Elden Ring, and Radagon attempted to repair it. The Golden Order Greatsword reads, Greatsword made of light, modeled after the Elden Ring itself, forged by the King Consort Radagon to proudly symbolize the tenets of the Golden Order. And Marika's dialogue delivered by Melina in the Altus Plateau.
In Marika's own words, O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both. Mine other self.
Say what you will about Marika, but the Golden Order was Radigan's, at least in the end. He was the one clinging to the failed order. And while this is certainly not groundbreaking information, given that this was well established in the base game, as I get into how Marika attempted to overthrow or break the Golden Order, I wanted to establish that this was her goal, and the Empyreans, at least in the first stages of her scheme, were her manner of achieving this. So as I stated previously, I believe that the Empyreans were chosen personally by Queen Marika, not the Two Fingers. But while I say chosen, I don't particularly believe that being an Empyrean is something that is given. Not a title of honor or earned, but rather it is an inherent gift. The Tooth Whip is an item found in the DLC, and its description states, quote, "The flesh of the shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others." And we witness the standard outcome for shamans being melded with others in the form of the Jar Innard's enemy throughout the Lands of Shadow. And it is made abundantly clear in the DLC that Marika was a shaman. And while the jarring of the shamans was clearly used as a form of punishment by the Hornsent given the ghost NPC dialogue in the Bonnie jail, the ulterior motives of the Hornsent were much more sinister. They were using the shaman and their inherent ability to meld with others to try and create something new. Quote, "Nigh sainthood awaits you within." It's difficult to summarize this information given that it was the topic of the most ambitious video I've put up on this channel, but in short, I believe the Hornsent were attempting to create saints, to create Empyreans, those beings that could meld with the divine, and that Marika was the pinnacle of what they were trying to do with the jarring process. She was a successful attempt, while most of what we see are horrendous failures. She was made to be an Empyrean, not inherited, but achieved through the jarring process. She was made to meld with a god. You don't have to buy into this theory wholeheartedly for the following to make sense, but there is abundant evidence for this being the case, and if you're interested, watch this video here. Shamans could meld with others, and Empyreans could meld with gods. And the ability to meld with a god is, in my opinion, what grants Empyrean status. We see Marika quite literally melded with a god in the form of the Elden Ring. We see Malenia melded with a god in the form of the Rock God, and we know Miquella was at one time melded with Saint Trina. This easily explains Miquella and Malenia's Empyrean status. Born of a single god, they inherited this ability from their mother. But Ranni, on the other hand, if you view the shaman/Newman ability to meld with others as a recessive trait, or Marika's enhanced ability to meld with a god, it can be assumed that Ranni inherited this from her father, who was also Marika, and her siblings simply didn't inherit it due to Rennala being in the mix. I believe that Marika wanted to create an Empyrean for the purpose of surrendering her godhood to another, and that Miquella was originally her preferred choice. In a video titled "The Great Tree Actually Did Exist," Tarnished Archaeologist discusses the seal above the entrance to the Erd Tree. This seal depicts the Elden Ring at the base, followed by a tree, likely the Erd Tree above it. And coming next, above the depiction of the Erd Tree, is a depiction of Miquella's cocoon. This being a depiction of Miquella's cocoon can hardly be debated given just how accurate the depiction is. If we zoom in on the cocoon, we can see that it's an oval, sideways, and has a dip on the right edge. And when looking at Miquella's cocoon in-game, it has this same shape, including the dip on the right edge. And above the cocoon, a new tree, likely the Halig tree. While with the release of the DLC, we are left with far stronger evidence that Miquella was the intended next god of the coming age, it's worth mentioning that there was evidence for this before the DLC's release. This image depicts the Elden Ring and the age of the Erd Tree, Miquella's cocoon and the coming of a new age, the age of the Halig tree. A new tree for a new age completely separate from that of the previous age, displayed by the fact that the Halig tree is seemingly outside the Lands Between, or at least far enough away to where the roots of the Erd Tree are not present. Again, credit to Tarnished archaeologists for this theory. Far before the release of the DLC, Erdtree roots can be found in every region of the game, including Farum-Azula, but not in the Haligtree. And with the release of Shadow of the Erdtree, the idea that Miquella was trying to separate himself entirely from the previous order is only bolstered. So the seal on the Erdtree displays the intended path Marika wished to take in regards to her succession, and this is even further evidenced by the cutscene we get at the end of the final boss fight of the DLC. Lord Brother, I'm going to be a god. The remembrance of a god and a lord states, in their childhood, Miquella saw in Radahn a lord, his strength and his kindness that stood in stark contrast with their afflicted selves. And so Miquella made his heartfelt wish that Radahn would one day be his king consort. This cutscene is the depiction of Miquella making his heartfelt wish. And we know from this remembrance that he made this wish, quote, in their childhood. This further implies that Miquella, when he was still young, knew that he was going to be a god, the god of the coming age. Now obviously Miquella was always young, but you know what I mean here. So Miquella knew that he was going to be the god of the coming age, and was already seeking a consort. And with the depiction of the new order above the entrance to the Erdtree, I believe that Marika knew this as well, that she had chosen him. Miquella was the intended heir. Now obviously somewhere along the line of this plan coming to fruition, Marika had a change of heart. Too much happened to imply that Miquella was still the intended heir by the time we, the Tarnished, enter the fold. The Elden Ring is shattered, the Haligtree fails, the Tarnished return to the lands between and are guided by Marika's grace. Something changed. And this is when things get pretty speculative in regards to Marika's thoughts on Miquella as the intended heir. Perhaps with the failure of the Haligtree, Marika believed that Miquella was no longer a viable option and moved on. And we'll get into what she moved on to next later in the video. When we reach the Haligtree, we see that it has been infested with rot. And once we reach its base, we can see why. Malenia has been asleep at the base of the tree near the former resting place of Miquella's cocoon, her hand resting upon the tree. Malenia was afflicted with the scarlet rot, and her presence at the Haligtree clearly spread her affliction throughout the entirety of the tree. Malenia's armor refers to the Haligtree as a husk, and the Haligtree crest great shield reads, carried by knights who have vowed to serve Miquella's Haligtree. Yet now, with the Haligtree misshapen, this wondrous rendition is a fleeting fantasy. So the Haligtree clearly failed without Miquella there to nourish the tree with his blood. It failed and festered with rot. Obviously, we the player know now that Miquella abandoned the Haligtree intentionally and sought the Realm of Shadow. His plans changed, and it begs the question, was Marika aware of this? As I stated earlier, I theorized that due to the seal on the Erdtree, the Haligtree was as much Marika's plan as it was Miquella's, if not more so. In fact, likely more so, given that we know now that Miquella abandoned the Haligtree intentionally to seek the Realm of Shadow, and perhaps with its failing she moved on. But if it's to be understood that the failing of the Haligtree, or at least the rotting of the Haligtree, came about when Malenia was brought back to the tree toward the end of the Shattering War, then that means that the Haligtree did not fail until well after the shattering of the Elden Ring. Marika did seem to have a plan for the Tarnished long before even the birth of Miquella, evidenced by her dialogue spoken by Melina at the Third Church of Marika and the Church of Pilgrimage. We know that if it is to be understood that these words were spoken directly to Godfrey, then this must be prior to the birth of Miquella and Malenia, because Radagon would not have been consort yet. Now I'm going to attempt to reconcile this later on in the video. It's actually my favorite part, given that it covers Marika's plans with the Tarnished. I just wanted to briefly bring this up here so that you all watching knew that I wasn't missing this. I don't think this stands against the evidence that Miquella was the intended heir. It's written right on the side of the Erdtree. However, again, I will be attempting to reconcile this later in the video when I talk a little bit more about the Tarnished. So there were 3 possible candidates to succeed Queen Marika. 3 options in Marika's mind to bring about a new age. And I say her mind specifically, because as established previously, I do not believe that neither the fingers nor the greater will were any longer involved in the world, at least to any meaningful effect. Obviously, the Elden Beast was still involved in the form of the Elden Ring within Marika, but I am assuming that her will and the will of the Elden Ring, if that was even a thing, were one in the same, given that they were one in the same. So these candidates were Miquella, Malenia, and Ranni. I've removed the Glowmide Queen from this list, seeing as we just don't know if she was active at the time or how active she was, regardless of the fact that she is or was an Empyrean. Due to Malenia's rotting affliction and her complete and utter devotion to her brother's claim to godhood, I don't believe Marika would have put any stock in Malenia being a possible candidate for godhood, at least not in the form she desired. Malenia hated her rotting affliction and never embraced it, save at great need in her battle with Radahn. And according to Radagon's Rings of Light, quote, Miquella abandoned Golden Order fundamentalism, for it could do nothing to treat Malenia's accursed rot. This was the beginning of unalloyed gold. So nobody wanted an age of rot, except this guy. And these guys. So with Marika no longer considering Miquella for godhood and Malenia as she is, that brings us to Lunar Princess Ranni. Before getting into why I believe Marika did have plans for Ranni, I want to talk about the Guidance of Grace. The Guidance of Grace points to Caria Manor. Not only that, but it also guides you from Ranni's rise to Renna's rise when Ranni departs on her journey. I wouldn't have previously put much stock into this, given that I believed Grace simply pointed to various points of interest. However, I've recently found that that's not the case. Most of the Guidance of Grace points either to Shardbearers themselves or the roads leading you to the Shardbearers. For example, in the Altus Plateau, the sites of grace that have guidance either point to the road to the Volcano Manor and follow it, or the road leading to the capital Landel. This is almost always the case, save a couple odd instances. Grace points to the Church of the Plague, Castle Morn, and Castle Sol. I suppose you could argue that the Guidance of Grace pointing to the Church of the Plague and Castle Sol are involved in finding a Shardbearer, Malenia, but that doesn't reconcile Castle Morn. And assuming Grace points you to every mini-dungeon, this doesn't work either, given that there is no Guidance of Grace pointing you to the Shaded Castle. I felt the need to mention this, but there are obviously dozens, if not hundreds, of more valuable points of interest within the game that Grace does not point to. And I know that From Software doesn't do anything by accident, but I can at least confirm that there is at least no other Guidance of Grace that points to one of the other endings save Ranni's. And of course, the Age of Fracture, if you consider the Guidance of Grace pointing to the Shardbearers, also pointing to the Age of Fracture. There is no Guidance of Grace for Fia's quest, no Grace pointing to Goldmask, nor the subterranean shutting grounds where the Dung Eater is, just Ranni. And this makes enough sense to me, seeing that Ranni's ending, aside from the Frenzy Flame ending, is the only ending where Marika is really freed, and the Golden Order comes to a true end. We are not mending the Elden Ring in Ranni's ending, it's fading away. And this falls in line with what was established previously. Marika wants an end to the Golden Order. She doesn't want it changed, she wants it gone. Now obviously the Elden Ring and the Golden Order are two very different things, but I still think that if Marika's goal was an entirely new order, this very much is that. The goal with Miquella's Haligtree was likely the same, to establish a new order. And I mean Marika's goal. We know Miquella sought to establish a new order as well, completely detached from anything that tied him to his former life. At least, this is the explanation given by Count Ymir for Miquella's actions. Quote, every young Miquella saw things for what they were. He knew his bloodline was tainted, his roots mired in madness. A tragedy if there ever was one, that he would feel compelled to renounce everything when the blame lies squarely with the mother, end quote. And Miquella's Circlet of Light reads, this circle was to be the very foundation upon which Miquella's Age of Compassion would be built, should it have ever come to pass. Almost implying that the circlet would sort of replace the Elden Ring as the foundation. So the point is, while Miquella and Marika, I believe, both wished for a new order to be established, somewhere along the line their plans for doing so were sundered. Setting this Mikola-related tangent aside, I don't believe prior to the shattering of the Elden Ring that Marika had any notion of Ranni becoming the god of the coming age. But I certainly don't think the guidance of grace in and around her questline was a mistake. That perhaps after all was said and done and the lands between had much fallen to ruin, that Marika in her fractured state saw Ranni as the best outcome. Now, I've never been in the camp of those who think Marika was involved in the Night of the Black Knives, but as I've began to dig deeper into the lore of this game, I've returned to the question of Marika's betrayal of Malekith more than once. Remembrance of the Black Blade reads, Malekith was a shadowbound beast given to his Empyrean. Marika's sole need of her shadow was a vessel to lock away destined death. Even then, she betrayed him. What was this betrayal? His only job was to keep destined death safe. Yet it doesn't say he failed, it says she betrayed him. If the description ended with, even then, he failed her, then this wouldn't even be a question, yet here we are with the question of what exactly was Marika's betrayal of her shadow. You would be hard-pressed to convince me that Marika wanted Godwyn killed. Additionally, to convince me that Marika wanted her son half-killed and then turned into the Prince of Death, an undead nastiness spreading throughout the lands between, causing a plague of undeath. No, I don't think that was part of Marika's plan. I'm not even sure that the death route was part of Ranni's plan. Now, it's not outside the realm of possibility that Marika wanted her children to die a true death, but this is besides the point. Whatever her purpose, if we assume that Marika allowed Ranni, or conspired with Ranni, to at least help her steal a shard of the Rune of Death, this answers a lot of questions. First of all, the question of her betrayal of Malekith. She gave him one job to do, and she betrayed him, assisting in the stealing of a shard of the Rune of Death. This also explains how Ranni was able to steal it in the first place, which is never exactly explained, and how Ranni obtained the Blasphemous Claw. The Blasphemous Claw reads, on the night of the dire plot, Ranni rewarded Praetor Rykard with these traces. Should the coming trespass one day transpire, they would serve as a last resort foil, allowing Rykard to challenge Malekith the Black Blade. The story trailer implies that the stealing of the shard and the death of the demigods occur on the same night. That doesn't mean that's necessarily the case. Ranni could have made the Blasphemous Claw with the shard of the Rune of Death and given it to Rykard. But I thought it worth mentioning, and just kind of a cool idea, that perhaps Marika gave it to her, just in case Malekith discovered the plot and sought revenge. Most prominent of this evidence, however, is still the remembrance of the Black Blade. I've never been able to find an answer to this betrayal before that really satisfies me, and this explanation does. That while Marika assisted with the stealing of the rune, what came after was Ranni's doing. As Ranni says herself, quote, there's nothing wrong with a well-laid scheme. Ranni quite clearly leaves the Black Knife Assassins high and dry after the night of the dire plot. In a video titled Night of the Black Knives Dissected, Elden Ring creator Smotown breaks down Ranni's involvement in the plot and how she seemingly abandoned the assassins after their task was complete. So if you want a more in-depth lore breakdown on this subject, feel free to check that video out. But in short, we find the Black Knife ringleader, Alecto, imprisoned in an Everjail on the Moonlit Plateau, a place that clearly most people do not have access to, save the Carrion royal family. Black Knife Tisha's ashes read, she was the daughter of the Black Knife ringleader, Alecto, and was killed protecting her mother during their flight from the royal capital. The remaining Black Knife assassins are scattered throughout the lands between, outlaws hiding in various locations. Toward the end of Ranni's quest, we come across the dead body of her war counselor Iji, surrounded also by the bodies of dead Black Knife assassins who clearly perpetrated the killing. We also find more dead Black Knife assassins directly outside Ranni's rise, slain by Blide. So whatever Ranni's transgression against the assassins was, they clearly were not happy with her. She likely did not hold up her end of the bargain and simply used them to perpetrate the Night of the Black Knives, leaving them high and dry. And whatever it is that Ranni did or did not do for them, they tried to kill her for it. I illustrate this simply to support the claim that Ranni is clearly capable of great deceit, and I believe she deceived Marika as well. I believe she deceived Marika into allowing her to steal a shard of the Rune of Death, and then proceeded to carry out her own designs, and in doing so severed her physical body from spirit, killed Marika's son, and let loose upon the lands between a plague of undeath in the form of Deathroot. And I speculate that this was what drove Marika to the brink, causing her to shatter the Elden Ring. That her plans had gone so far south, her children dead or worse, undead. I maintain that Marika was herself deceived by Ranni, because I can't imagine a scenario in which Marika wanted any of this to happen. Not so much because I know her mind, I don't, and I think it remains one of the greatest mysteries of this game, but that we know she did shatter the Elden Ring, which set off the Shattering War. And we know that this happened after the Night of the Black Knives if the story trailer dialogue is to be believed. That the story trailer dialogue states that the demigods began to fall, beginning with Godwyn the Golden, implying that many demigods were killed that night, explaining the presence of multiple walking mausoleums in-game. And this, in my opinion, is enough to push anyone to the brink. I kick myself because I'm unable to find a viable reason for Marika assisting with the stealing of the Rune of Death, or what it was that Marika wanted with this transaction. Even though I do believe it to be the case, I believe quite strongly that she assisted Ranni with the sealing of the Rune of Death. I just don't know why. I could come up with a number of solid reasons, but none of which would be backed by any significant lore. The best I could come up with was perhaps a promise to kill Radagon, seeing as at the time I would assume Marika's primary goal was still to prop up Miquella as the god of the coming age, and Radagon would be opposed to this. And I could speculate on this for days, but I won't put you all through that. Regardless of Ranni's egregious transgressions, I believe it likely that Marika's grace still guided us to Ranni intentionally, Ranni being the only Empyrean left in the Lands Between who Marika believed could bring an end to the Golden Order and a viable new one. And that brings us to the Tarnished. Based on Marika's dialogue in the Third Church of Marika in the Church of Pilgrimage, this was always part of the plan. At the Third Church of Marika, quote, "My lord and thy warriors, I divest each of thee of thy grace. With thine eyes dimmed, ye will be driven from the lands between. Ye will wage war in a land afar, where ye will live and die." And at the Church of Pilgrimage, quote, "Then, after thy death, I will give back what I once claimed. Return to the lands between, wage war, and brandish the Elden Ring. Grow strong in the face of death, warriors of my lord, Lord Godfrey." Why did Marika send the Tarnished? Why did she tarnish them all at once? This, I believe, is when her plan really began to come to fruition. While I think a lot of things occurred that were never a part of Marika's plan, or at least not what she desired, including the undeath of her son, the departure of Miquella to the realm of shadow, and others, I believe the Tarnished were always a part of the plan. Not a last resort or a Hail Mary, but a vital part of her plan. As established above, if we assume that Miquella was the intended heir, and was meant to bring about a new order, and overthrow the Golden Order, there would have been great opposition to this. For starters, Radagon. Radagon was set to preserve the Golden Order at all costs. Even in the end, when the Order was broken beyond repair, he sought its endurance. A number of Marika's children may have supported the Golden Order as well. Regardless of where you fall on whether Radahn was with Miquella or against him, there's certainly evidence to support that Radahn may have supported the Golden Order's endurance, if it came down to battle. Demigods such as Rykard and Ranni obviously would not have, but that doesn't mean they would have supported Marika's motive of putting Miquella in her place. By creating an army of tarnished warriors, Marika is essentially creating an army of loyal soldiers. Or rather, disloyal to the Golden Order. The Golden Order cast them out and hounded them from the lands between. And upon their return, brought about by Marika herself, they would have fought to overthrow that which cast them out. Marika and the Golden Order. In the end, fulfilling that which Marika desired, bringing about a new order. And as we know, Miquella accepted all, tarnished, misbegotten, or otherwise. I believe that this was in the end Marika's big plan with the Tarnished. To tarnish enough warriors to where upon their return they would overwhelm that which remained of the Golden Order in the lands between, fight to overthrow the Golden Order, brandish the Elden Ring, and implant a new order, a new god, and just enough went wrong to where her plan never came to fruition. First of all, Miquella had far different plans. Second of all, Ranni killed a good number of Marika's children, including Godwyn spawning the Death Root. Third, the shattering of the Elden Ring left Marika largely incapacitated and imprisoned within the Erdtree. And fourth, the Shattering War left the lands between broken, and her remaining children pitted against each other. So by the time the Tarnished began to return, they were disjointed, unorganized, serving different goals and purposes. The Confessor armor set reads, quote, "The churches outside the lands between dedicated to the teachings of the Two Fingers send confessors out to follow the guidance of grace. The confessors are loyal servants to the Two Fingers, ready to hunt down and quietly dispose of their enemies," end quote. And Krepus's vial dropped by Riley the Idol, a confessor found during the Volcano Manor questline, reads, "Eliminates all sound made by the wearer during movement. A ritual implement used by the Round Table Hold assassins. There was a time when Tarnished who had strayed from guidance feared nothing more than utter silence," end quote. Heavily implying that these confessors were hunting down and killing their own people, those who had strayed from grace. Also implying that many strayed from the guidance of grace, which is also pretty easy to grasp just by speaking with various NPCs. We know from items like the Coated Sword, the Finger Maiden set, incantations such as Lord's Heal, and many others, that the Two Fingers did attempt to guide the Tarnished when they returned to the lands between, especially in the beginning when the Fingers were still, quote, full of vigor. But given what we know about the Fingers now, who's to say how valuable this guidance really was? Or if they were even guiding the Tarnished towards Marika's will, their own, or elsewhere's? There was no army of Tarnished led by Godfrey returned to the lands between to overthrow the Golden Order. There was no real concerted effort. And of those that tried, they had this guy to contend with. Not until a lowly Tarnished of no renown arrives hundreds, if not thousands of years too late and finally does something about it. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. I'm new to making these kinds of videos, so please leave your thoughts below. Much of this video is speculative in nature, so again, your thoughts in the comments are much appreciated. Please subscribe if you ever want to see me again, and thanks for watching.